A very warm welcome to the 14th episode of the podcast of the World Wind Energy Association, The World of Wind Power. Today, we will speak about, a big market in the Southern Hemisphere, Australia, very interesting country, which just had elections. So we expect there will be stability also in terms of energy policies for the next years. Australia plays a very interesting role, and it's my pleasure that I have a person, an expert from Australia who knows very well what's going on. My name is Stefan Gsänger. I'm Secretary General of the World Wind Energy Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome today Jarra Hicks, who works with the Community Power Agency. Welcome, Jarra.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Jarra, you've just told me that you're even one of the founders of the Community Power Agency. We talk later about the role of community energy, but maybe first you'd like to introduce yourself. What's your role at the agency, and what is the agency's role also in the Australian energy landscape?
Sure. So I'm one of the founders of Community Power Agency, and we've been working now for 14 years in the Australian renewable energy space. We were founded with the ambition to support communities to be involved and to be at be on the front foot in this transition to renewable energy. But the work that we've done over the years has really been about understanding and improving the social elements of this transition into renewable energy, whether that's through utility scale projects or whether it's within the policy, state and federal policy context, or whether it's through community-led and community-owned renewable energy projects. So we, as an organization, we work across all of those stakeholders from communities on the ground to industry through to government. And yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic space, keeps us very, occupied. My role, I'm one of the directors there still. And yeah, I guess my journey with wind energy started when I was actually a project manager developing a community-owned wind energy project in Victoria. And I was responsible for, managing the project, but also for all of the community engagement, the communications. And so I got that level of experience on the ground, what goes into doing the feasibility and the planning for a small wind farm, a community-owned wind farm. But unfortunately, at that time, and this is many years ago now, we had a government in Victoria that basically made wind farms illegal or very, very difficult. And so that project, for various reasons, was abandoned, and I went on to do other things. But certainly that experience gave me a lot of appreciation for the importance and the role of really good quality community engagement and for involving communities in the wind development process.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. Then you have the kind of general perspective from your work, from your general work, but also this practical one. We come back later to that, but I think the importance of community engagement is now more and more obvious, and we work on that now as well. But maybe you can, before we talk about what it's kind of driving the development, but also what keeps it back, what is now the market situation of the power market in Australia, and what's the role of wind power in this?
Mm. So Australia is well underway towards its transition to renewable energy. We now, on some days there are certain states in Australia that are all of their electricity needs are being met with wind and solar power. So as a country, we're well on our way. Wind power is playing a really strong role in that. Um, our first wind farm in Australia, I think, was built in the late 80s. So we've got sort of a long experience with wind energy. And at the moment, wind power makes up about 14% of our national electricity generation. Um, that and that's growing year on year. Um, but I would say, like to date, most of that development has been utility scale. So there are a handful, literally a handful of projects that are smaller scale and owned by, by community organizations or companies that have been set up, cooperatives that have been set up by the community. But a vast majority of wind energy to date has been utility scale and led by either government corporations or private companies. Um, yeah, I think that's I
Maybe
I suppose the other thing just to mention is there's a strong role slated for wind energy alongside particularly solar PV in
mm,
Australia reaching 100% renewable energy. So it's got a important role to play going forward.
it's, by the way, 14 seems the magic number today. It's our 14th episode, and you have 14 years with the agency, and you said wind is
Yes.
now 14% share of the electricity supply in Australia. So
Yeah.
if you maybe can describe a little bit now, Australia is a huge country compared to
Mm.
most other countries. So you have plenty of space compared
Yeah.
also to the population. Where is most of that wind? Where are these wind turbines installed? Are they installed in certain states more? Are they installed in countryside more? Could you explain a little
Yeah.
bit?
So Australia, being a very big country, we also have one of the biggest interconnected national electricity networks in the
Mm,
world as well. And that's called, the national electricity market in Australia. And so that market connects all of our eastern seaboard, Queensland, New South Wales, ACT, Victoria, South Australia, and Tasmania are all connected together through the national electricity market. And across all of those states, with the exception of the ACT because it's very small, um,
ACT is Canberra, if I'm right, right?
that's basically just the city of Canberra, yes. All of those states have wind farms.
Mhm.
Um, we have excellent wind resources, particularly in Tasmania and South Australia, so coming off the Southern Ocean, but also right up those winds flow right up through the high country on the Great Dividing Range of Australia. Mostly our wind farms are in country areas, less populated areas.
Mhm.
We don't yet have any offshore wind developments, although we have several offshore wind zones where there are a number of projects in planning stage. Um, but yeah, most of the development at present is in, you know, farming sort of and rural areas of our various states.
Now, I always hear from South Australia, which has practically no hydropower, but now a very high share of solar and wind, which are
Yes.
variable sources, and obviously on the way to 100% renewable energy. That discussion that happens in many parts of the world is it's not possible to have a high share of solar and wind in particular because they are not always available. But I believe that in some states you have already good solutions. I mean, I think Tasmania is hydropower. That's, of course, the lowest hanging fruit because hydro and wind is an easy kind of combination. But many countries don't have that. So, what's your experience in Australia? How is that done?
Yeah, I think you're right. Do have some really excellent hydropower resources in Tasmania, but also in the Snowy Mountains.
Mm,
And they do play an important role in firming our grid. But also the fact that the national energy, our national elect sorry, the national energy market connects the electricity grid, but from, so far north to so far south in our
mm,
country, because it's such a huge country. You do have a situation where if the wind is not blowing in one area, it probably will be blowing somewhere else, and same with the sunshine. Um, but there's no doubt that there's a really important role to play for storage. And so Australia has already installed a number of very large grid scale batteries that are playing a role. And we are still, only partway through this journey. We do still have some coal-fired power stations and also some gas plants that are playing a peaking role to help fill in the gaps in those moments of time where the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing.
Mm.
So obviously it's a complex balancing act. And in our country, I think, we have a very, I think, sophisticated and advanced way of trying to plan this transition process through a national document led by the Australian Energy Market Operator
Mm.
called the Integrated System Plan. And it lays out basically, what's the process for us to change our national
Mm.
electricity grid towards to be 100% renewable and be able to still, of course, deliver reliable and affordable and low carbon electricity.
Mhm. Oh, that's very interesting. And I know that many people around the world are really keen to learn from that experience. As I said, hydropower, that's of course more known, but you have some of the biggest batteries worldwide in Australia, right?
Mm. That's my understanding. It's not something that I personally know a lot about, but yeah, certainly we have quite a number of grid scale batteries,
Mhm.
and also an increasing number of what are referred to as community batteries, but really in practice what that often means is that they're more distribution network scale batteries. So they're bigger than household, but they're positioned in the lower voltage network. Yeah.
So it's very interesting that I think technically Australia is on track to achieve that 100% renewable energy, different states with different sources or technology.
Yes.
Now let's talk a little bit about kind of the structure in terms of who are the main actors in the Australian market. It's interesting, by the way, that you speak about community sized or utility scale, because that's obviously reflecting what the reality in Australia is. Um,
Yep.
that's not common in around the world, but can you maybe briefly first say who are there any kind of major actors in particular in the area of wind energy who are investing in the larger wind farms? That probably doesn't seem to be the
Mm.
case.
Look, we have a really open and diverse market of companies involved in wind development in Australia.
Mm.
So, um, in terms of project development and ownership, there's a lot of international companies that come and are playing, in the Australian wind development space, such as, you know, Acciona, for example. But there are also Australian-based companies that are, very grassroots, homegrown. Um, and then there's also state-owned companies that play a
Mhm.
role. So different states are different in terms of the level of public ownership of the electricity system and different parts of the electricity system being either privatized or still under public ownership. Um, but in terms of wind farm development and ownership, it's generally by um, international or Australian companies.
Okay. So you have a free market, we can say.
Yes.
You have a diversity of players, but it's not necessarily local investors, so they are not so much.
No, that is one thing. The way that wind energy has gone in Australia, unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of incentive or support or opportunity for like community or locally owned companies or cooperatives to participate in wind energy development. We do have a small number of examples, such as Hepburn Energy and Denmark Community Wind Farm, where communities have developed and own small wind farms. And though they're excellent projects, they're my they're my favorite kind. They're fantastic. They're much loved by their communities. They're keeping money local. They're enabling local people to invest and be active in the transition. But developing a wind farm is a complex endeavor. And in our country today, we just have not had the stable policy environment or any form of support to
Mhm.
incentivize communities to be active in this process. Um, and so we're seeing a huge gap in our market, really. In Australia, we're leading the world on, household participation in terms of rooftop PV.
Mhm.
And we are doing very well at utility scale, big scale, wind and solar, but there's this whole um, opportunity in the middle space, that's larger than what you can do at a household, but smaller than what's generally done by the commercial players. That is really a missing piece of the puzzle at the moment. And it's beginning to get a lot more attention because it offers a lot of different kinds of benefits, both from a technical perspective and in terms of grid stability and the role they can play in the market, as well as in terms of the contribution they can play to regional development, to boosting local economies, to building social license and participation in the transition.
You've already mentioned the Hepburn wind farm. Let me mention that we gave them the World Wind Energy Award in 2012, so that's quite a while back, because
Yes.
we felt, also from the global perspective, that this initiative is really important to show to Australian general public how beneficial wind farms can be. Now, you mentioned, you used the word unfortunately, such projects are not playing greater role. Could you speak a little bit more why you think so? What's the public kind of attitude? Now, especially you had the election campaign, I guess that, or I know that part of it was also about energy policies and politics. Why did you use this word, unfortunately?
Well, honestly, I think there is a lot of community ambition
Mm,
for community energy projects. There are over 120 operating community energy groups who've done over, 500 different kinds of community energy projects. So there is a lot of community interest and community ambition to be involved in renewable energy in Australia, but we've lacked the support and the incentives and the stable policy environment to incentivize communities to to enable them to do what they're passionate about. And so for example, in other countries, there's been things like targets for community ownership or for community energy projects. There's been feed-in tariffs to incentivize or to give some additional financial incentive for community energy projects. There's been grant programs or loan programs that enable community energy projects. We haven't had any of those things.
mm.
We've had some state-based ad hoc grant funding available to support communities to do feasibility studies, but that those programs have been short-lived. Um, they have had great success. They've supported projects, but they haven't continued for whatever reason. So the unfortunate element is that our policy context and our government support just hasn't been there to to back up the community ambition. But also there hasn't been the incentives available, or it's a policy gap, I think. But
Mm.
in terms of, it's common overseas in countries like Denmark and France, and for communities to be co-owners or co-investors in corporate projects. So the opportunity for local people to take up shares in a wind farm nearby that's being developed by a big company, but they can have a stake in that. That has been very rare in Australia. It's
Mhm.
only happened twice in two wind farms.
Mhm.
Um, and again, there just isn't the incentive or the support or the policy in place to help that to happen. And so, unfortunately, it's sort of a case of if the companies don't have to do it, they don't, and they haven't.
So you mentioned 120 community energy groups who would be interested in playing a role in that. But that means there's a huge market potential, which could be also from the general, if you talk about industry, interest should be exploited. So there's a kind of gap that could be bridged, right?
Yeah, that's definitely my perspective. And those projects to date, they've done much smaller projects because
Mm,
that's the space that is easy for them to operate in. So there are incentives for projects that are under 100 kilowatts, and they're mostly rooftop PV projects. And so most community energy projects to date have been solar PV projects under 100 kilowatts, or they've been energy efficiency projects, or electric vehicle bulk buy projects, or all manner of excellent different energy-based projects. But we're just really not yet seeing very much in that space of megawatt scale wind farms in particular. There are now some megawatt scale community-owned solar farms beginning to happen, which is great.
Okay. Yeah, I think that it sounds a little bit familiar because we look around the world and in those countries which have a similar, I'd say, socioeconomic structure. We saw last year a dramatic decrease of new installations. I mean, we had outside China a decrease from around more than 40, 41, 42 gigawatt to 34 only. And that affects many European countries and the United States. Australia was one
Yes.
of the few countries where there was an increase. But what we see in many countries is that the complaints that permitting processes take more time. And that is, of course, always related to what is called public opposition, and or some people talk about acceptance. I've always don't like this kind of perspective because I think that, and that's what we also see where it works well, that the proactive attitude of people who say we want to have that wind farm, that could really create an enormous additional momentum. So that's something that you believe would help. And maybe could you specify which policies you think would be necessary in addition
Mm.
to what exists already?
Mm. Yeah. I think that just there's a lot of scope to increase and enhance the way local communities are able to um, be active participants in the way that wind developments take shape in Australia. And I think an important element of that is being able to enable communities as co-owners of projects or as co-investors in projects,
Mm,
as well as being able to initiate and own, wholly community-owned projects in their own right. And I think if we were able to diversify the ways that communities can participate and be active in this process, that people would feel much more positive about having, wind developments in their region because they've been part of it. They're directly involved. They're literally invested. And I think there's many different ways that we can policies that could incentivize that. I think it's things like enabling crowdfunding policies that make it more simple for fractional investment for many small investors to participate in owning shares in a large company.
mm,
It's things like all of our state-based renewable energy targets. They run auction processes. Social performance, social value, community participation, all of those things can be incentivized through the merit criteria of those auction processes.
mm,
I think similarly within our renewable energy targets, having targets that are for community participation and community ownership. For example, in Scotland, they have gigawatts of their national renewable energy target set aside for community-owned projects.
mm,
And I think alongside that, being able to have programs that offer communities the support and the information, the resources they need to be able to initiate these projects. So um, we've been advocating for a long time to the Labor government, who's just recently been re-elected, for them to run a program, establish a program called local energy hubs, that would see local communities supported to be able to understand the renewable energy transition and to be able to get involved. Whether that's, at a household level, just by being able to understand how to electrify and use EVs, but also at a community level to be able to do community-owned projects, as well as just be able to understand better how they can engage with large scale renewable energy development and get good outcomes for their communities. But we're really seeing a need for investment in the social aspects of this transition. If we don't invest in supporting communities to understand it and be involved, that's when we see fear and misinformation and concern generated in local communities that can turn into opposition. It's not surprising. What we're proposing here is actually a really big change process for local communities. We work with some regional areas that have a new transmission line, 4 wind farms, 5 solar farms, a big battery, all in their nearby vicinity. That represents a big change, and for them to feel comfortable with that, they need to be able not only to understand it, but to know how it's going to involve them, respect their views, create opportunities for their local businesses and for their local people, and deliver real benefits for their communities. And community co-ownership, co-investment, and community-owned projects have a really important role to play in that context.
Mm. Well, I just comes again into my mind this one example. We spoke about this before we started recording the podcast. A wind farm in eastern Germany. People don't have that much money, but which just went through the permitting process for repowering, and it's also at the same time converted into a cooperative, locally owned company. And during the permitting process, there was not a single objection. I think that is usually not happening anywhere, but it happened there because the people there, obviously, they feel it's part of, they own it. It's part of what is good for them.
Yes.
Obviously, we need to think more about that. I think that's really something that the whole industry must look into. Just briefly coming back kind of to those also maybe larger players. When you look at the manufacturing side in Australia, those companies who would benefit from such a strong growth, who are the companies that are playing a role in, because they're also jobs involved. Is there certain players that are on that side, aside from the developers, manufacturers?
Yeah. So across the sort of the long history of wind development in Australia, we have at times had some local manufacturing of different components for wind turbines, such as, the masts and things. But at present in Australia, there is no local manufacturing of components, to my best knowledge. And so that's an enormous gap. Everything is being shipped in from overseas.
Mm.
And I think really that's been a reflection of the fact that actually our market and our policies around renewables have been quite volatile over the last, 15 years. And even until, just last week, we had an election, and the Labor government was reappointed, and they have a very strong renewable energy agenda. And so we can see some stability going forward now. But had that election gone a different way, we could have been faced with a very different future scenario. And I know a lot of companies were really feeling that policy uncertainty. I know companies that abandoned projects within the last year that they'd invested a lot into in terms of feasibility, just because it felt too uncertain in the Australian market. So I think we've been plagued by that. Also been plagued by the fact that we are still quite a small market, a big country, but quite a small and isolated market in a lot of ways. And so manufacturing of components, yeah, it's a gap in terms of national manufacturing at the moment. We also have, because of that, partly because of that, and partly because of just the international demand on components, like there are supply chain issues, not just for wind energy related components, but also, for solar and batteries and things as well, and cables and, everything. And we're also at a point where we're needing to dramatically ramp up the skilled workforce who can work in renewable energy projects. And that's something as well that is just getting underway, I would say, and needing to ramp up very quickly. And different governments are putting a lot of energy into that at present.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is all really, really very exciting. So what we see is Australia, the direction is right. You have a new government now, which is the old government. So there's more or less stability, which is also good. But you clearly indicated that there should be some improvements to have more of that kind of community engagement and local ownership. And w- things happening in that way. When do you expect Australia could reach that point of having a grid with 100% renewables? I believe Tasmania has that already. South
Yeah.
Australia is also close to it. Maybe others like Queensland not so close. But how fast could that happen if things go really well?
Hmm. That's staring into a crystal ball type stuff, but we have a national target for 82% renewables by 2030.
Hmm.
I think that is still the official national target.
Hmm.
Um, I think if we were really to knuckle down and focus on how do we do this well, how do we how do we bring people along, how do we manage our supply chain constraints, how do we build the workforce? If we really were able to coordinate that well and in a way that's really integrated with local communities, I think that we could get there. We could achieve that target. Um, I, Australia as a whole then has a 100% renewable target by 2050.
Hmm.
Um, and look, I do think it is possible. And I think one of the things that's making it possible is the participation of households and of communities, to be honest. So in Australia at the moment, we have 3.1 gigawatts of rooftop PV.
Hmm.
So we have households playing a really important role in our energy transition. We also know that we have a lot of potential within the lower voltage distribution network in
Hmm.
our country. And so if there were incentives and support mechanisms for communities to start doing more mid-scale projects, so in the range of um, 1 to 10 megawatts, and that being a mix of solar and wind and batteries, I think that we could see that playing a really important part alongside the larger utility scale projects as well. And
Hmm.
that would really help us to speed up the pace of the transition because it would help to build that groundswell of support and understanding
Hmm.
for renewables at large.
Well, let me bring some more kind of optimism into this. As you said, if you reach 82% in 2030, I'm sure it won't take you another 20 years to reach the 100%. The other 18% that can go very, very fast. It's been very good to talk to you, hear your perspective. I think Australia is perceived as one of the important front runners in some areas. We now heard from you. Well, there's some work that still needs to be done. That's been very interesting. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing your insights. Let me also mention that you expect a baby, so we wish you all the best for that. And that
Thank
you
you.
can then, at the end of the day, I have children myself. It's very important that we do this work for our future generations.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, all the very best. Thank you so much. All the best personally and also for Australia to stay on track and maybe be even faster than what the official goals are.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much to our audience for listening. If you want to contact us, please feel free, drop us an email. We also connect you with our Australian colleagues. Thank you and goodbye.